Hello, and welcome to this final session in the series, A Journey Through Acts, a guided tour through the Acts of the Apostles in 6 sessions. The focus this time is on chapters 20 through to the end of the book at chapter 28. So that's chapter 20 through to the end of 28. If you've watched session 5, you may already have read these chapters, but don't worry if you haven't, as I'll take us through them step by step, giving you the references along the way. You can stop the video at that point and read the verses if you so wish. It will also help to have a pen and a piece of paper at hand to jot down anything that comes to mind. Chapter 20, verses 1 to 26. At the end of the last session, we left off with Paul at Ephesus in the aftermath of a riot. This had been stirred up by the silversmiths, who were threatened by Paul's preaching, fearing that it would undermine their trade at the shrine of Artemis. Paul encourages the disciples he will be leaving behind and then leaves for Macedonia. Paul continues his journey of encouragement to believers as he passes through the region and reaches Greece, where he stays for 3 months. Then, as he is about to set sail for Syria, Paul discovers a plot against him, so decides to return through Macedonia, accompanied by converts from places he had visited along the way. There are some echoes here of how the disciples of Jesus left their own homes to follow Jesus. Paul's followers went on ahead to Troas, and he joined them 5 days later, sailing from Philippi. He and his companions stayed at Troas for a week. Luke then tells us that on the first day of the week they met to break bread. This was the day before they left Troas. Incidentally, this is the first reference in Acts to the Christian community coming together on the first day of the week, that is, on Sunday rather than on the Jewish Sabbath. Paul is involved in a lengthy discourse, so long that a young man named Eutychus dozed off and fell from a ledge, dying from the fall. Was he really dead? Well, the crowd certainly thought so, and they were living in an age where people were much more used to seeing dead bodies close at hand than in our own sanitized age. Amazingly, it seems that Paul restored Eutychus to life and continued with his talk, and with great understatement, Luke says, "Meanwhile they had taken the boy away alive, and they were not a little comforted." The companions of Paul travel on from Troas, sailing for Assos, while Paul travels overland to meet them there. From there they sail to Miletus, bypassing Ephesus, no doubt due to the dangers there. Remember the riot? Paul was also eager to be in Jerusalem by Pentecost. Why do you think that was the case for Paul? It's likely that Paul was carrying a donation for the church at Jerusalem and wanted to deliver it in time for the festival. From Miletus, Paul sends a message to the Ephesian elders to meet him there. When they arrive, Paul delivers what is his 3rd longest discourse in the Acts of the Apostles. In it he speaks of service, endurance, and faithfulness. Paul is aware of the dangers that lay ahead, not only for himself, but for the fledgling Christian community as a whole. He also warns the Ephesian elders that there will be wolves who come among them, reminding them of how the church community must protect the flock with their own lives. When writing this account of Paul's words to the Ephesian leaders, Luke may well have had in mind the difficulties that had arisen in the church following the death of Paul, reading back, as it were, and perhaps accentuating the points Paul was making. Paul offers himself as an example to follow, exhorting the Ephesian elders to serve the weak. It is more blessed to give than to receive. At the end of the chapter, as the elders say farewell to Paul, they do so with tears. They know from what he has told them that they will not see him again, though knowing that the church would go on. Like Jesus, Paul then heads to Jerusalem, where he too will face suffering. Acts 21, 1-16. On Paul's journey to Jerusalem, travelling along the coast, he encourages the disciples at every opportunity. At Tyre, he is warned again about danger at Jerusalem, but like the Lord he served, this did not deflect him from his destination. At Caesarea, Paul stays with Philip the evangelist. He was one of the 7 set aside by the apostles, as you may remember in Acts 6, to manage the practical affairs of the early church community. While there, a prophet named Agabus came down from Judea. We encountered him earlier in Acts 11, verses 27-29, where he predicted a looming famine. Again, in prophetic fashion, this time Agabus acts out what would befall Paul at Jerusalem. Paul's companions urge him not to go to Jerusalem, but like Jesus, his face is set. There will be no turning back. Paul, like Jesus, will be turned over to the Gentiles by Jews, just as Agabus says. Paul's companions then remain silent, except to say, "The Lord's will be done." Chapter 21, 17-26. On arrival at Jerusalem, Paul and his companions receive a warm reception. James and the elders were thrilled at Paul's report of what God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. There was, however, some concern, because many Jewish converts feared that what Paul had accomplished among the Gentiles was in some ways undermining the traditions of Judaism, which was so important to them. The Jerusalem elders managed this in 2 ways. First, they encouraged Paul to undergo a rite of purification with 4 men who were under a religious vow. This involved having their heads shaved and having a sacrifice offered for them at the temple. This would give a clear message that Paul was not seeking in any way to undermine the law. Second, a Jerusalem council would send a letter to the Gentile believers, reminding them to be sure and keep those laws which would cause offence to Jewish converts if they were broken, such as eating food offered to idols. These were important steps in the early development of the church and demonstrated a real sense of give and take between Jewish and Gentile converts to Christianity. Chapter 21, 27-40. After being in Jerusalem for around 7 days, Jews from Asia see Paul in the temple and stir up trouble by making false accusations against him. It seems that these troublemakers had followed Paul, perhaps from some of his earlier destinations. There was a great commotion, and Paul was dragged outside of the temple. Word reached the tribune that they were about to kill Paul, so he sent soldiers and centurions to rescue him. Paul was saved from the lynch mob, but arrested and beaten nevertheless. When brought before the tribune, it appears that Paul had been mistaken for an Egyptian terrorist. Paul speaks in Greek to the tribune, who is persuaded to give Paul a platform. Paul tells the tribune he is a Jew from Tarsus and asks permission to speak directly to the crowd who had been so stirred up against him. Permission is given for Paul to do this. Chapter 22, 1-21. On the steps of the temple, Paul addresses the crowd in Hebrew, setting out his credentials as a faithful Jew and follower of the way. He then goes on to tell the second version of his Damascus Road experience. The crowd became enraged when he claims that it was God's decision for him to preach to the Gentiles. Chapter 22, 22-30. As the crowds were so volatile, the tribune orders Paul to be returned to the barracks and flogged. Why do you think the tribune ordered that? This did not seem to be so much a punishment as an attempt to find out from Paul why the crowd had become so angry at him. At this point, Paul plays his Roman citizen card. It was not legal to flog a Roman citizen without trial. Roman citizens had a certain prestige and protection from the state. The centurion reports back to the tribune about this, who in turn is shocked and worried. He could be in big trouble for allowing a Roman citizen to be beaten in this way. Paul is released and brought back before the Sanhedrin, the tribune ordering them to convene, with a view to discovering the accusation being made against Paul. Chapter 22, verses 30 through to chapter 23, verse 11. I'll say that again. Chapter 22, verse 30 through to chapter 23, verse 11. Like Peter and John before him, back in Acts 4 and Acts 5, Paul now finds himself before the Sanhedrin. Luke makes it clear that the Jewish leaders are in cahoots with the Romans. After being struck at the orders of the high priest Ananias, Paul responds by calling him a whitewashed wall, reminiscent of Jesus' comment to the scribes and Pharisees in Matthew 23, verse 27. Paul is then very canny, wise as a serpent and harmless as a dove, by sparking debate about resurrection from the dead. This put the Pharisees, who believed in resurrection, in a bind, as they could not disagree with Paul about the general point. As a result, division and dissension ensues among the council, which threatens to turn violent. So as a precaution, Paul is taken back to the barracks by the Romans. At the barracks, Paul is encouraged by the Lord to keep up his courage, as he is to testify for the Lord in Rome, as he has in Jerusalem. Chapter 23, 11 to 35. The following morning, Paul's nephew overhears a plot to kill him. They were going to ambush Paul. Now aware of this, Paul asks one of the centurions to take his nephew to the tribune and tell him what he has overheard. The serious nature of the plot is evident in the tribune's response. It was above his pay grade. To resolve the matter, he orders Paul to be sent to Felix, the governor of Palestine. On arrival at Caesarea, Paul is kept under guard in Herod's headquarters. Chapter 24, 1 to 9. 5 days later, Ananias the high priest, some of the elders, and an attorney named Tertullus arrive from Jerusalem. In front of Felix, they ingratiate themselves to the governor and then set out their case against Paul, describing him as an agitator and profaner of the temple. The Jews at Caesarea jump on the bandwagon condemning Paul. Chapter 24, 10 to 23. Next comes Paul's opportunity to defend himself. He challenges the false accusations made against him. Paul acknowledges that his accusers see the way as a sect, but explains it as a fulfillment of the law and the prophets, not as an attack on those things. Felix was left unsure about what to do, so keeps Paul in custody, perhaps for Paul's own safety as much as anything else. Felix has some knowledge of the way and is not convinced by Paul's accusers. Chapter 24, 24 to 27. With insufficient evidence and motivation perhaps to convict Paul, Felix delays a decision and keeps him in custody. This may have been a house arrest, albeit a detention which lasted for 2 years. There is also a hint in this section at verse 26 that Felix was looking for a bribe. After 2 years had passed, Felix is replaced by his successor, Porcius Festus, who keeps Paul in detention. Acts chapter 25. Some of the Jewish leaders were conspiring to kill Paul, asking Festus to try him, transferring him first to Jerusalem. Their intention was to kill him along the way. Instead, Festus tells them to meet him at Caesarea, where he will hear their case. Once again, false charges are brought against Paul, but instead of conceding to Festus's request to go to Jerusalem for trial, Paul appeals to the emperor. Festus was left with no option but to grant Paul's request. After several days had passed, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea to welcome Festus to his new appointment. Festus talks with Agrippa about Paul and the decision that has been made to take him to Rome. Why do you think Festus needed the support of King Agrippa? This was King Agrippa II, son of Herod Agrippa I, who put the Apostle James to death. Festus was not sure of his grounds for passing responsibility on to the emperor for the trial of Paul, and wanted to gain support from Agrippa for his decision. He knew that he needed a sound charge against Paul to set before the emperor. Chapter 26. Paul is brought before Agrippa, and he has a canny approach towards the king. He starts by praising the king's knowledge of Jewish customs and moves from there into his defence. Paul speaks about his conversion and his preaching, and then makes a strong appeal for Agrippa himself to believe. Paul was never one to miss an opportunity to present someone with a challenge of the gospel. In private, Agrippa acknowledges there were no grounds to imprison or execute Paul. In fact, it was only Paul's appeal to Rome that prevented him from being set free. Why do you think Paul sustained his request to be tried before the emperor in Rome? Acts shows the spread of Jerusalem to the ends of the earth, symbolized by Rome. Paul had a passionate desire to visit Rome, and this would be met, albeit as a prisoner. There are certainly some signs that the gospel had reached Rome before Paul's arrival. Chapter 27. Paul was transferred with some other prisoners to a ship sailing for Italy in the custody of a centurion named Julius, a man who treated Paul kindly. A slow and difficult journey by sea as the seasons changed from autumn to winter. Paul's warnings about the sea dangers were ignored, and the centurion, being more influenced by the pilot and owner of the ship, took little heed of what Paul was saying. As predicted, they encountered a violent storm, and after about 14 days of struggle against the storm, Paul encourages all aboard to eat their fill and throw the remaining food overboard. This is not enough, however, to prevent a shipwreck. As the crew attempted to beach the ship, they strike a reef. It's only the centurion who prevents the soldiers from killing the prisoners to stop them escaping. It is everyone for themselves to get ashore, and they reach land on what turns out to be the island of Malta. Acts 28, 1-10. Having survived the storm, Paul and the rest of the ship's company winter in Malta. Paul is bitten by a snake, and this causes the locals to see this as a bad sign. After all, why would God allow a shipwreck survivor to then be killed by a snake? Paul is unaffected by the snake bite, so the locals then start thinking he is a god, no doubt to Paul's dismay. The shipwreck survivors are shown hospitality by Publius, the leading man of the island. Paul, in turn, heals the father of Publius, along with many other islanders. All the provisions needed for Paul and company are supplied by the islanders, and 3 months after the shipwreck, they sail for Rome on an Alexandrian ship that had wintered in Malta. Acts 28, 11-31. Paul seems remarkably free during this final part of his journey. There is no guard, and he's able to decide how long to stay in some of the ports. Believers from Rome travelled to greet Paul, no doubt a great encouragement to him. A guard was reinstated at Rome, but Paul was still allowed to choose where to stay. As per his usual custom, Paul speaks first to the Jews. Some were convinced of his message, others not, and they disagreed with him. Luke ends Acts with a brief summary of Paul's 2 years in Rome. Luke must have known about Paul's martyrdom at the time of writing, but he ends the book abruptly with no reference to this. Luke may have felt this to be an appropriate end to the book, the gospel having reached the ends of the earth. This brings us to the end of our 6-week journey through the Acts of the Apostles. I hope it's been helpful and will encourage you to return and reread the book for yourself. It is a fascinating account of how the church began and how the gospel spread outwards from Jerusalem during those early years. I always find something fresh each time I go back to Acts, and I'm sure the same will be true for you. This concludes the present series of Bible reflections that I've been offering, but do keep your eye on the Sheffield Cathedral website for future courses. And once again, thank you for watching.